Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of the AnthroPuzzled podcast. I'm your host, Abby Letzinger, and every 2 weeks we'll explore how anthropologists are forging unique career paths beyond the usual academic sphere. Tune in, get inspired, and start piecing together your own career puzzle within the world of anthropology. On today's episode, we have Patti Sunderland. She graduated from the University of Vermont with a PhD in Cultural and Social Psychology and from New York University with a Master's of Philosophy in Anthropology. She currently works as a founding principal of Cultural Research and Analysis, Inc. How are you doing today?
I'm fine. How are you today?
I'm doing great as well. So what exactly is it that you do and why is it important in regards to anthropology?
What I do, what I have made my career doing is what we could term consumer research. That's at least what it was called when I started my career many years ago now. Sometimes some of what I would do could be called design anthropology, even user experience. But what I have done for corporations or for nonprofits is something that involves studying their customers or their users, hence consumer research. And that could be for branding questions. A company wants to rebrand or it's a new product and wants to new branding. It could be for new product development, like when a new company or an older company wants to come up with new products. And sometimes it's for things like service design. So it could be the design of a retail environment. And sometimes, clients will hire me just to find out about their customers, like what are people thinking about sustainability or how are people really using YouTube? Questions like that. So that's what I do.
Okay, so do you use participation observation or ethnographic interviews for that?
So I really try. I think of the backbone of my research as ethnographic research. But usually the way that I have framed it is that it's anthropological research, so anthropological cultural analysis. So rather than really like ethnographic participant observation, it could even be something like a focus group. But then it's about in the analysis that I try to bring anthropological thinking to bear. So I do interviews, I do participant observation, I do observation, I do focus groups, I do many different things. It sort of depends on the question at hand.
Mm. So what does a day-to-day kinda look for you?
Okay, so what a day to day is, if we're just thinking about the work, it's kind of divided into like there's the before you get the work. So usually that would mean, a client or someone who's approached you. And sometimes I work as a subcontractor with other companies. So someone approaches you and you give a proposal for the research, right? How you're going to do it, how much it's going to cost. And then you kind of wait and see, do you get it? And that's usually really pretty fast, but there's that. And then once you get the project, there's the preparing it, right? So, and there's conversations with the client all along. But to prepare it, you might have to prepare the interview guide or, how are you, going to find people that you're going to talk to, all those kinds of things. So you're preparing it. Then there's the actual field work, which, when it's good, you travel to go there. And when it's really good, you get to travel internationally to go there. When it's not as good, you do it online, which, has been more and more frequent since COVID, since everyone found out that you could do research online. And so you do the interview, the focus group, the participant observation. You do whatever you're doing for your research. And then another phase is writing it up. And I guess, roughly speaking, it's about, maybe half of the research. No, let's say a third of the research is doing the work. A third is writing the report and communicating that. And then the other third is getting the project and preparing. So that's kind of what a day looks like.
So how do you navigate between a corporate's interest and ethical responsibilities of being an anthropologist?
Oh, that's a good question. I think that one thing as a consultant, because I work for different companies and different things, you can always say no to research,
Mm.
right? So myself and other anthropologists that I know that work in this business, they usually have something they won't do research on. So Like, I have a colleague who always said she would never do research with children. And for me, I would never do research for like how to make people, smoke more cigarettes or vape more, something like that, right? And I also have turned down research, working for recruiting for the army. So I think that everyone can decide what they are going to do and not do. And what I have found, like when I started this work, I actually didn't think that I was going to go into this field because it felt like from anthropology that there were, more ethical things to do, like teach or work for a nonprofit, things like that, right? But what I kind of found out, like it's often a lot more benign than you would think. If I'm working for a company and it's about coming up with an air freshener, so it's understanding how people think about personal space in order to find out about an air freshener, it's kind of benign, you could say.
Mhm.
And then sometimes the questions are really even more interesting. It can be, like how to create more sustainability or something. That's often quite in line with anthropological ethics. So I think it's not such a problem as people might think.
Okay. Do you ever worry that your work is being used in ways to manipulate the people rather than serve consumers?
Mm, that's a very good question. I think that, sometimes companies do with the research results things that you wished they had not, or they don't take your advice, kind of things like that. So just as an example, this was a long time ago and it was for a bank actually. And it was about people who filed for bankruptcy, right? So he talked to all kinds of people, and what's really interesting about it, actually, was that I really learned in that it didn't matter how much money you had, because we talked to people from like in mansions, you could say, to people living in the projects. And so there were people who were not making ends meet across the spectrum, right? So it was really about living beyond your means, whatever those means were, as well as, some other things like pet veterinarian bills were a big thing, a big catalyst pushing people over towards that, nearing bankruptcy stage. So we really came up with very good guidelines for the bank to help people and you to be more in partnership with people so they could avoid bankruptcy. And a lot of that was also just understanding how customers thought about credit cards. First, it was about credit cards, really. That's what was, all it wasn't pet bills, it was credit cards. Ultimately, they get you into a lot of financial trouble very often. So, how to be more of a partner with credit cards so that people would not face that bankruptcy stuff. And, they heard it, they listened, but ultimately they decided that it was a better business model for them to just to have sort of churn, let people have bankruptcies. The bank writes them off and they just continued on. So it's not that they used our research to manipulate anybody, it's that they just didn't listen.
That's disappointing. I feel like everybody kind of goes through that, at least once in their life, whether it's a friend or a family member, and they're just like, hey, so such and such happened. Do you have any advice? And you're like, yeah, sure, here. And then they're like, go and do the complete opposite. And then they come back, they're like, so this didn't work. And I'm like, because you didn't do what I recommended.
Right. And I think your example is a good point because what I was gonna add, whether it's our own research that's directly for companies and they can, do whatever or not listen, this or potentially manipulate. But the same thing would be said of any kind of academic research. I think the one thing I have learned through all this is that the line between academic research or the ethical line between academic research and this applied research is not as clear cut as you would think.
Mm,
Like both sides kind of like to make the other side really an other, but they're not, right? Just
yeah.
happen the same way.
So what kinda got you into consumer research? Like, what was your experience? Were you inspired by something? Like, what got you into anthropology?
Okay, so I was already studying anthropology
Huh?
at NYU. And so while I was a graduate student, and there was already an anthropologist, actually a few anthropologists that were working in consumer research. So there was a project about selling luxury cars that they needed help on. So one of those anthropologists contacted one of my professors at NYU and, asked, "Do you have any graduate students who might be interested?" And that's how I was recruited to do this. And it was actually a really interesting project. And so there were other graduate students that went to other dealerships, but I hung out at an Acura dealership, which was kind of new at that time, as well as a BMW and Volvo dealership, and tried to really analyze the symbols by which the salespeople were selling the cars. So that's how I originally got into it. And from there, I did other freelance projects and the next one was kind of on over-the-counter medications. And we investigated things like headaches, and we did audio diaries of people, like, talking when they had a headache, and I was so interested. There were interviews and diaries. So I think I didn't mention in the beginning that I also have done a lot of work with diaries, whether it's video diaries or audio diaries. It's often a really good method to get ethnographic findings. So, okay, I did that. And then I, finished my degree. And when I finished my degree, I actually started working for a nonprofit research institute that at the time was studying a lot about drugs and AIDS in the New York City environment. And it was kind of a research where there were principal researchers and a lot of people working for them. And, that's where I also learned that, there were things that were, I would say, exploitative of the people they were working with. While it seems like that would be research that was all about, like, doing good, in some ways it was not. They needed to have their research population per se. Anyway, that went on. And as the years went on, I was doing some writing, some adjunct teaching. And from time to time, I would freelance again doing consumer research. And then, one day I said, I really love doing this work. I could actually make this my career. Why not? I really love doing it. So then I set about freelancing for a lot of other people until I eventually opened up my own company. Then for a long time, I was teamed up with Rita Denny and some others with Practica Group. And then, I went back to cultural research and analysis, the original company I opened. So that's kind of my story of how I got into it.
Do you feel that your perspective as a consumer has changed because of the work that you've done as a consumer researcher?
What's really funny is, like, any of my friends would tell you, I'm kind of like a bad consumer. Like, I'm not really into consuming things. Like, like, I never have been, right? Like, sort of buying things. So it's much more the puzzles about everyday life that interest me in these things. And I guess some of the work has influenced me, but in ways you wouldn't think. Like, I did a awful lot of work about house cleaning because I did many, many projects for SC Johnson. And, they have like Windex, Pledge, scrubbing bubbles, all kinds of, cleaning products, laundry products. So I learned a lot as part of that company about which cleaning products worked really well. So perhaps my work has changed, like, how I clean, or so those kinds of ways. Or I guess I've also changed my shampoo based on, a shampoo company I worked for. But so in very trivial ways, you could say.
Is there something that you would wish you had known about consumer behavior that you had known prior to getting into the work, or like advice that someone had given you?
No, but, I can say one of the great things about this work has been, there are a number of anthropologists that work in and around this domain. And one of the great things about doing the work is that, almost always the projects, because you're also trying to do them fast. So the projects are often with other people. Like, if anthropology is kind of set up in the traditional way, it was kind of the lone anthropologist went somewhere, even though that wasn't always true. There are many, like, anthropology couples, right? So, but the idea often was the lone anthropologist goes off somewhere and does their research and wrote their own book. In applied research, it's often you're working in teams. And one of the great pleasures has been to work with other anthropologists. That's like one of the great things. And the other great thing was the sort of places it took me, right? So, like, in different projects that took me to different countries were always, like, really interesting.
What was your favorite project in another country, if you're allowed to talk about it?
Oh, the favorite project in another country was, one project we did, which was actually, ultimately about air fresheners, like the example I used before, which was exploring personal space in France, the US, and Vietnam. So I went to France, another anthropologist went to Vietnam, and another one was in the US. And that was just a very interesting project, perhaps because it was very anthropological, the way that different cultural notions and different notions of self in each of these cultural contexts influenced how people thought about personal space. So that was just a really great project. Another one was going to Thailand because I hadn't known this before, but Thailand is actually one of the great places for sustainability. And so this company, which was like a personal care thing, like they wanted to come up with more sustainable packaging. And one place they wanted to go to get ideas for that new packaging, like what could be new ideas for new packaging, was to go to Thailand. So that was just very fascinating. And that was a combination of diaries and interviews and a little bit of participant observation to understand packaging. And so then it, becomes very interesting because you have to have a translator help you. And that translator and often a cultural specialist helps you get a kickstart into understanding that cultural environment. But a really favorite project was one I had worked for a liquor company, and there are actually not many of them in the US. And then the person who was the marketing manager had moved to Russia and contacted me to do a study of this. It's called Ararat. It's an Armenian cognac that was very popular when it was the Soviet Union and, before the Soviet Union broke up and then had lost popularity. And at first I thought, oh, I can't do that. I don't have any Russian expertise. And then it was one of these things where I thought, well, I could say no, and then, I'll never get a project from them again. I could say yes and blow it, not do a good job, and I'd never get a project from them again. Or I could say yes and do well, and then there was hope for a project in the future. So I ended up saying yes because what was there to lose? So it was so fascinating, of course, as an American to go to Russia. And there I worked with a lovely young social scientist who's since become a good friend, Lubava Shatokina, if I'm saying her name correctly, which I'm probably mispronouncing somehow her last name. And we did a fabulous project about Ararat brandy and understanding how it lived during the Soviet Union, like when people had it, which, there was vodka as a kind of everyday thing, and Ararat brandy is anytime there was a special occasion or as a special drink to give teachers or doctors or someone you really wanted to thank for something. And then it was the environment of what had happened post-Soviet Union when all other kinds of brown liquors, as they're called, whether scotch, any kind of whiskey, rum, other things, had come in and competing. And then it was about, okay, how to rebrand it and reposition Ararat to once again have cultural cachet in Russia. And the company was able to do that. And in fact, it did lead to another project about Ararat in the US. So for any listeners here, in LA, you can get a lot of Ararat because there's a lot of Armenians and it's, an Armenian brandy. I should give it a try. It's really, really good brandy or cognac. It's allowed to have the name cognac, one of the few times that France, sort of allowed it, even though it's not from cognac.
Do you feel that consumer behavior is changing due to like the progression in technology and social media?
Well, boy, that's a big question. Yes, it's like in a way, things are always changing. And yes, because people are changing, it's kind of like it's not really our consumers changing because it really, it's called consumer research, but we should just think people, right? People are changing in light of technology and they are also not, right? So it's kind of in the same ways. And in those same ways, I guess it affects people, then it would affect consumption, right? Or, it's trivial in a way, like people are buying more things online, but and that changes in some ways to well, it certainly changes how people shop, right? But it doesn't And, social media changes things, but as much as the world changes, then it would in sort of consumer because it's about people, really.
Okay. So do you feel that by becoming an anthropologist, it has kind of broadened your viewpoint and perspective on the world?
Definitely. I always because I studied psychology first, and it was then, in graduate school kind of when I was ABD that I flipped over to anthropology. And I always felt like one of the best things I had ever done was to study anthropology. And I think that anthropologists are always fighting for this because it's not like the default way of viewing the world. A more default way of viewing the world, especially in business circles, is a kind of, psychological way of the world, right? And thinking about people's so-called needs and their preferences. And it's a very kind of individual oriented thing. And I think the way that anthropology taught me to look at larger issues, beyond the individual and the way that our cultural environments and like social symbols and social life and social institutions and organization affected life. I think that definitely broadened my viewpoint and broadened, my analysis, which is why I said in the beginning it was more like cultural analysis that I was trying to do, trying to look at that sort of beyond individual in all of these, whatever question people had, like even the sustainability or new packaging for sustainability. That's not just an individual question. It's a larger question and it's about symbols, really.
Mhm.
So, yes, and then, of course, it gave me a much more international view of the world. It helps to know things about what Malinowski did in the Trobriand Islands and so on. It helps. It helps enlarge one's worldview, I would say.
Yeah. Now, if someone wanted to get into consumer research, what are they kind of looking at salary-wise, whether they're entry level, senior positions, anything like that?
I think it really varies, and That's kind of the that's kind of the thing. And, very often people could start pretty low, and a lot of people sort of freelance, but some people who have worked for big tech have made what you could call small fortunes. They they have made a lot of money, and, more senior have made a lot of money. But there's also layoffs from the big tech. So it's not a secure, um, it's not necessarily secure, but you probably have the potential to make more than you would in academia. Of course, unless you're a superstar in academia.
Right.
So it kind of depends on, where you are in those.
Exactly.
uh,
Yeah. And I think that that's I mean, for most industries, the salaries are very varied because it depends who you're working for, what state and city you're living in, because someone who lives in LA might be making more than someone who's living in, like, Kansas City, but that's because their cost of living is higher in LA than it is in Kansas City, while they're doing the same job, so I guess that also has to be taken into account.
Right, right. But it's very variable. But, money can be made.
Mhm.
But, of course, there's also always a downward push. Companies are also often trying to get their research for as, cheaply as they can. So, that's one of the challenges right now, and it will remain to be seen. There like a sort of story has been for companies, how to do more with less. So maybe how to do more research in-house, how to do more research with AI, those kinds of things. So, or going online instead of in person because it's quicker and cheaper. So I think that's always the tension. What I would also like to see is like the ability to do larger research projects or more in-depth research projects. So I think that's often a challenge for people in the field.
Yeah, no, that's definitely fair. Now, before we get into our final 4 questions, is there anything we haven't discussed today that you'd like the listeners to know about?
I can give you another example of research that I didn't mention before, but it speaks to your question about do you ever feel like you're manipulating or do you feel that the ethics, it just sort of speaks to all of those issues. So this was a study for a milk company, like the organization that represents dairy farmers. And, milk has been going to, there's so many different kinds of milk now, all these things. But what this company realized, and I guess this seems to be fact, that if you don't start drinking like dairy milk as a kid, you are never going to drink it. You're never going to become a lifelong drinker, right? I mean, so if kids aren't drinking traditional cow's milk, they never are going to. So together with their ad agency decided, okay, we want to target, there's often a kind of militaristic language here. They're going to target mothers to get mothers to make their kids drink more milk. So they hired us to figure out how to talk to mothers to get them to drink more milk. So we studied mothers, first of all, right? As well as we had a focus on mothers and what does it mean to be a mother today, and a focus on milk and what does milk mean today. So what quickly became apparent, this is just in the US, what quickly became apparent was that mothers had a whole lot on their plate because the expectation was not just to be a good mother, you had to be a great mother. And, to be a great mother was the norm. And there was huge expectation, if your child had any kind of problems or issues, you needed to be their advocate in the stores, with the medical profession, all this kind of stuff. So mothers, women were driving themselves a little bit crazy trying to be a great mother, and were very, very busy. Meanwhile, if you look at milk, everyone kind of agreed, like, milk is really good for kids' bones, teeth, that kind of things, the calcium. Everybody could talk about calcium, vitamin D, that kind of thing. But there were many, many ways to get calcium or vitamin D that wasn't about milk, whether it was added to orange juice, whether it was in Tums, with many, many things. Now you combine that with also in eating, the sort of parental thing in the United States is always to give your kids a choice, right? So do you want peanut butter or do you want tuna fish? It's a constant choices, sometimes forced choice. But so if the kid chose not to drink milk, it wasn't a big battle to have because there were other ways for them to get those nutrients. So, mothers were not pushing it. And then if you look at milk itself, like, it was a very interesting thing. If we think of like latte or cappuccino or something, there's a lot of milk in that, often dairy milk. But people just think of that as coffee, right? Or like milk was kind of a weird drink, like people never took it out of the house, right? Like people are, walking around with their water or sodas, all kinds of drinks or their coffees, but they were never walking around with milk. So putting all this together, one of the things we really advocated for was you have to get off of this mother thing, right? Like you have to, like, you can't just target mothers. It's too much. You need to include fathers and you need to include like popular culture, right? Like, because you can't put yet another thing on mother's plate. Like it's just too much. So get away from the mothers, which became like a big fight with the ad agency. But eventually we prevailed. And part of it was also like redesign how people think about milk, right? Like the milk in cereal is having milk, or, chocolate milk is also okay. And, because they didn't want to touch like milk and cookies or things people talked about. No, that starts to get unhealthy. And we were like, no, it's okay to have milk in these other ways. So they came up with a really spectacular advertising campaign. This was kind of like after the got milk stuff that included fathers as well as mothers, and included like taking milk out to the tent, right? And having it in a tent or at the park, and showed kids drinking chocolate milk and showed people pouring big amounts of milk from gallon things into their cereal. And so that was like a really good project where you could really feel like you turned things around, like it was a puzzle that you could help solve, and you really changed something from that, what was a very like sort of moribund idea, like just target mothers again, to something that was a lot more exciting. So,
Wow. I didn't drink milk growing up. Like, yeah, I had it in my cereal or whatever. My husband did drink milk growing up, and you can tell because like he'll chug a glass of milk just straight up. And I'm like, you're a psychopath. Like, I can't drink milk unless it's in something. But he drank milk all the time when he was a kid, and so now he's like, "Yeah, no, it's normal. I'll just go pour myself a glass of milk." I'm like, "Who does that? Who just drinks straight up milk? That's just weird."
Right. You have to grow up with it, or evidently you really don't.
Yeah, pretty much. So anyways, into our final 4 questions. So what is the best piece of advice you would offer to someone who is interested into getting into consumer research?
Again, now it might not be called consumer research. It might be called design research. It might be called user experience research. And there's also like semiotics is also something I haven't talked about. There's some firms that do semiotic research. Um, like you talk to someone from Space Doctors. Space Doctors often uh, focuses on semiotic research. I would say to meet as many people in the field as they can, kind of networking is a very, very important thing. And to freelance if they can, to get the experience and to go as broad as they can, like work on different projects, work on different things, and, sort of get your foot in the door. That's what I would say.
Yeah. Are there any changes you'd wish to see in your industry?
Well, the change that is probably never going to happen, but I wish it would happen. There is a huge push, across our country, I guess, for like sort of fast, quick, dirty, cheap, that kind of thing. If I could have a wish, again, and I kind of hinted at it before, if I could have a wish, it would be to have research projects that were bigger. Sometimes research just takes time too. Like I would just wish for the time to do the research and not like, oh, we need to find out, some huge question. We need to find out about like how American consumers are thinking about sustainability and we need the results in 2 weeks because we're moving ahead with something. So it's those kinds of like crazy, crazy timelines or really small budgets that, you really can't do things. You can't have multiple anthropologists working. So I would just wish that people would realize, kind of like with the milk study example, that sometimes just moving ahead with things, just doing things quick and dirty won't get you what you need. It really needs a step back and a little bit more time and a little bit more thought to find something that really has legs. So that's what I would wish for.
So what do you absolutely love about your job in the industry you work in?
So, what I absolutely love, what has really been good for me is that it's constantly changing. The projects are always changing and I just wasn't a person who could work for too long on one thing. So I have loved the diversity of it and I loved the travel of it and I loved like working with other anthropologists and I loved, it's like a puzzle very often the research and you're trying to figure things out. And in the applied world, you're trying to figure things out for a reason, right? You know, whether it's like how to get people to drink more milk, right? What would be the best way to do that? So I think those puzzles are probably what ultimately has kept me going and the diversity of it.
Yeah, that's amazing. So where can listeners learn more about you and what you do?
So, what I haven't mentioned, I have written some things with Rita Denny. Together with Rita Denny, we wrote a book called Doing Anthropology and Consumer Research. So that is a really good place to start to uh, find out about what we meant by consumer research and what we did. And then also Rita Denny and I together edited a book called Handbook of Anthropology and Business, and that includes so many chapters, way too many chapters, but as many anthropologists, as many people kind of working in business, in nonprofits and business. So I think that that's another huge way to find out more about what we do. And the other plug I would give for is, if your listeners don't yet know about EPIC, which was, it started off as Ethnographic Practice and Industry Conference, but it's epicpeople.org. And there's a huge resource for anthropologists kind of working in and around the business world in what I have been terming consumer research, and as well as design research and user experience, and for nonprofits. And they have a huge library of resources, and their conferences are really interesting and good ways to meet people.
Okay, awesome. Well, I want to thank you so much for coming on here and talking about your job and consumer research, and hopefully it inspires some individuals to go into it because you can never have too many researchers.
Well,
uh,
thank you very much. Thank you for having me, and, I hope it is useful to people who are listening.
yeah, of course. Alrighty. Well, I will talk to you later. And I think this was just like amazing. And thank you so much.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me, Abby.
Of course.
Thanks for listening to another episode of AnthroPuzzled. This show was produced by me and distributed in collaboration with the American Anthropological Association. A special thanks to Cheyenne Brewer for editing the website, L. Akers for the incredible logo design, and to AnthroPuzzled's intern Fiona for the episode descriptions. The music is courtesy of Chad Crouch, aka Poddington Bear of Sound and Picture. If you have any questions, you can reach me at abby.letzinger@anthropuzzled.com or as AnthroPuzzled on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. Until next time.